And then we can also, if there are things that you think really would be interesting to learn more because of their application in particular to San Francisco that we don't have information on. We do actually have, we've been participating in a network organized internationally between different cities. So we do have contacts where we can get in touch with and get more information in areas you think would be places we should particularly focus. So what we're looking to hear from you particularly is things that you think seem most applicable to San Francisco, and if there are other areas where you think we should look in more depth to learn more. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gracie to kick us off with London. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Colin. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and give an overview of London's congestion pricing system. And their congestion pricing system encompasses an 8.5 square mile radius around central London. And this was first implemented in 2003. And London had been studying congestion pricing since the early 1960s, but over time it never seemed publicly or politically feasible until the early 1990s when there was public transit decline in the city. Ultimately, they pursued a congestion pricing study in 1995, which led to this 2003 system that they have. And before congestion pricing was implemented, 90% of Londoners saw traffic congestion as an issue within the central city, even though that didn't necessarily transfer to approving of a congestion pricing program. Additionally, public transit was very unreliable through buses on the streets because of the congestion. So for London's pricing program, they charge a flat fee to drive within the designated central city zone, which is approximately $15 US. And their pricing hours are Monday through Friday, 7 to 6, with some exceptions during the winter holiday time. They have an annual net revenue of approximately $182 million US, which they then use for transit improvements for both bus and rail. So even though the fee is a bit extensive, it's approximately $15 US, there are some discounts and exemptions to the fee. So discounts and exemptions are different in the sense that discounts require registration with the Transport for London services within the city. And these give residents or any of these placard holders between 90 to 100% of a discount on the fee. Exemptions, on the other hand, don't require registration with Transport for London, but they just have to be vehicles that are registered with the United Kingdom's version of the DMV. So following the first year of implementation of their congestion pricing program, London evaluated how their program was working. Within that 1 year, they saw transit ridership increase by 38%, and this was mainly on bus transportation above ground. So although London is well known for having an extensive underground rail system, rail ridership remained consistent after charging began, but bus ridership increased. Additionally, greenhouse gas emissions went down 12% and traffic congestion went down 30%. So over time, congestion has still increased, but this has mainly been due to TNCs and private for hire vehicles. So beginning in, sorry, give me a second. Okay. Beginning in 2013, London began to increase the congestion charge over time to accommodate inflation as well as provide more transit improvements to their system. So there was still a large amount of people using private for hire vehicles such as taxis and TNZs, and these were originally both exempt from the congestion charge. Over time, London evaluated their program and decided to start charging TNZs, but still exempt taxis. There's also an additional charge for polluting vehicles, which qualifies through ultra low emission zones. And this charge is applied to pollutant vehicles based on vehicle classification. And this is in addition to the congestion charge. So for those vehicles, they have to pay both. And even though there are charges for TNV vehicles now, they still seem to have a high amount of ridership, particularly on Friday and Saturday nights. And there's approximately 18,000 different ride-hailing vehicles operating within central London during Friday and Saturday nights. Because of the current pandemic, London has suspended charging during this time to accommodate essential drivers or essential workers who have to drive through the zone. So this shows that London has made adjustments and is flexible depending on what is going on during the time. So some of the key findings from London are that public perception has definitely changed. So like I mentioned, before congestion pricing was implemented, 90% of Londoners did see traffic congestion as an issue. However, not that many supported the pricing program. As you can see here, 39% supported congestion pricing before the program was implemented, and afterwards, about 53% supported it. However, people did think it would be effective to have a charge in place to charge congestion. In addition to these numbers here, the Transport Committee for London conducted a survey of over 1,000 respondents this was in 2016, and it regarded the congestion charge, and 54% of these survey respondents said the charge was too high. So even though there is support for the program and they do see it as effective, they do think the fee is a bit expensive and should be changed. And the people who answered the survey were use different modes to travel. So about 57% traveled by car, 64% traveled by bus, 18% traveled by bicycle, and 13% by minicab or taxi. Going forward, London and other cities could learn that there needs to be a periodic evaluation of their program. As you can see, TNVs were unexpected and caused further congestion within the city, and they still seem to be operating there today, even with the congestion charge. Additionally, there needs to be more evaluation of traffic patterns and transit ridership going forward. So now we move over to Stockholm. So Stockholm's congestion charging zone is quite larger than London's. Their zone encompasses approximately 22 square miles compared to London's 8.5. And for Stockholm, they have quite a unique geography where approximately 2/3 of the inner city inhabitants live within this zone. So this shows how many people live within the zone and who do choose to drive are affected by the charge. In terms of Stockholm, it was studied for about 30 years prior to program implementation. And in the 90s, a tolling proposal was suggested, but also lacked political and public support. It wasn't until the early 2000s where a pilot program was approved for 2006. And this was a temporary program until voters chose to make it permanent in 2007. So before introduction to the program, 2/3 of residents disapproved of the proposal. But following seeing how congestion declined between 30 and 50% during the pilot program, those 2/3 of residents then chose to vote for it as a permanent program. So now we go into their pricing scheme. Stockholm's is quite different than London's, as theirs varies by season, time of day, and there is a daily max. So here we see during their peak season, which is late spring to autumn, when they see increased driving, they charge higher, but during the off-peak season, they charge less, and the daily cap goes down as well. Similar to London, they do use their annual net revenues, which in this case are 155 million for transit improvements. And when the program first began, they were able to invest in 197 new buses, 16 new bus lines, and expanded service on existing routes, as well as park and ride facilities, so people would not drive into the zone. So while Stockholm doesn't have discounts, it does have exemptions, but even to these exemptions, there are exceptions. So emergency vehicles and buses are only exempted if they have a total weight of at least 14 tons. Otherwise, they wouldn't qualify. Additionally, drivers with disabilities need to register with the Swedish tax agency to exempt their vehicle. There's also a business tax deduction in Stockholm, where businesses can also deduct the cost of the fee from their taxes on a yearly basis by notifying the Swedish tax agency. So now when looking at how their stats changed, and these represent numbers of the program evaluation after a year of implementation, transit ridership went up 5%, while greenhouse gas emissions went down 14% and traffic went down 22%. So for some of their key findings, Stockholm did do a research analysis following the pilot and the first year of implementation. And the research was conducted by various research institutions in Stockholm, including Lund University and the Royal Institute of Technology, as well as some other independent consultant agencies. And these conclusions were determined after studying the first year of implementation. So it appeared that higher income individuals were more affected than low income individuals. Few drivers actually paid the maximum of the congestion charges, so few paid the daily cap. And lower income individuals benefited from lower transit fares, which were lowered due to using the congestion charge for transit. Additionally, travel times in the central city were shorter, and a lower percentage were by car. I'm gonna go back. So another thing other cities can learn from Stockholm is to do an evaluation of a pilot program and pursue congestion pricing through a pilot program to see how public perception can change, as well as how congestion could change during that period of time. Stockholm also did this research analysis with an equity focus, so they really wanted to see how this program affected working class and low-income communities who did have to travel to the zone. So going forward, we look at New York City, which is the first US city to propose the charge and the first one to have it implemented, approved for implementation. Their state legislature approved it in 2019. So New York City's charging zone is beneath 60th Street of Manhattan, and it encompasses the central business district of New York City. And New York City has been considering congestion pricing on and off for several decades, and there have been failed proposals over time. There was a recent proposal in 2006 that failed, and then there was another one in 2014 that failed. But this new proposal that is going to be implemented was proposed in 2018, and it was really due to public transit decline, infrastructure decline, and unreliable transit service that really led to the push for this program. And this is also why New York City's major goal with their congestion pricing program is to invest the revenues collected from congestion charging to transit, more so than focusing on reducing congestion as a whole. So New York City plans, or is in the process of doing a phased approach. Their first phase was focused on finding transit improvements and identifying where transit investments can occur. This was all done and studied within the central business district that would be the charging zone. And they wanted to see how transit could be improved to this district from outer boroughs and suburbs of New York. So they looked for alternatives to driving, how to improve traffic enforcement, and overhauling their placard program to make sure whoever had a placard was actually qualified to have one. And during this first phase, they also looked at how to implement the infrastructure for pricing. The second phase was taxi and Tnc surcharges, and this occurred in February 2019. And basically, this is charges on ride-hailing vehicles within the central business district. And the fees vary by which service you use. So for taxis, it's a $2.50 tax or surcharge. For single users using TNCs, it's $2.75. And for shared TNV rides or other ride-hailing rides, it's 75 cents per customer. This fee will continue even during zone pricing, which is the next phase. And zone pricing is set to be implemented beginning in 2021, so next year. So yes, like I mentioned, it's set to begin next year, and this will encompass pricing for all vehicles under 60th Street in Manhattan. So while there isn't a set pricing structure yet, there has been suggestions that vary on how much should be charged depending on time of day, vehicle type, and if there should be a daily cap. So for now, the suggested fee from advocacy organizations in the area is between $3 to $9, depending on time of day and when congestion is greater. And they recommend only charging the fee once for entering or remaining in the zone. Anticipated revenues are between $810 million and $1.1 billion, which they do plan on using for transit improvements, which is their main goal. While there aren't any set exemptions yet, we do anticipate that the exemptions would be just for emergency vehicles and drivers with disabilities. There is a push to limit exemptions because they are trying to meet this revenue goal. There's also a policy where New York City is trying to give zone residents who make less than $60,000 a year a tax credit for whatever charges they accrue over time. So this is to benefit low-income residents within the zone. While we don't know specifically how transit ridership will increase, we do believe it will increase because there will be less congestion, which will better ridership and travel times for buses above ground, as well as improve ridership and transit infrastructure for rail underground. They do estimate that greenhouse gas emissions will reduce approximately 7%, and there will be approximately 59,000 less vehicle trips within the zone, which will also vary depending on what charging scenario is chosen. So like I mentioned, there's various advocacy organizations who have studied the New York City plan and how it could focus on equity. And they really think it's important to do this phased approach and make sure people are prepared for the congestion pricing implementation. They also want to make sure equity is the main focus in order to help the low-income residents who live within the zone, but also price based on when congestion is higher and limit the exemptions to meet the revenue goals to expand transit. Going forward, other cities can look to New York for best practices and how they implement it, especially since it's the first US city to implement congestion pricing, and making sure that the program is focused on promoting mode shifts and having a varying fee, like mentioned, to charge higher when congestion is higher, since the goal is to reduce congestion. But like I mentioned, New York City is unique in the sense that their goal is meeting the revenue target, and they really want to use that money for transit improvements, less than necessarily reducing the congestion in the area. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it back over to Colin for the discussion of what can San Francisco learn from these cities.
Great, thanks, Gracie. And so, yeah, this is where we really want to open it up to the PAC. And of course, the fun of having a virtual discussion is that the discussion has already started in the chat window. But there are definitely some great questions coming in, and I think we've answered a few of them in the chat window already. But maybe we can start with questions that have already come in the chat window, and then I'd also invite PAC members to raise your hand if you have other thoughts you want to share, either on things that you think are really interesting, takeaways that you think have implications for what we should be looking at here in San Francisco, or if you have questions that maybe we can try to answer about other cities. In the questions, let me get back to my chat window here. In the questions, it looks like we already have seen. One of the questions that I know we have pondered and wondered about ourselves is the transit increases, and this was a question I think from Peter Strauss, about basically why the transit ridership increase in Stockholm was relatively low, especially compared to London. And Grassi, do you want to talk a little bit about the how that might be part of the kind of investment package that went along with the transit or the congestion pricing program?
Yeah, definitely. So yes, Stockholm did have less of a transit ridership increase than London. And one of the reasons that we think this is possible is because they did invest heavily in park and ride facilities. And this was implemented through their pilot program. So during their pilot program, they also made parking at these park and ride facilities free. They later began to charge during the permanent program, but one assumption that can be made is that people switched to other modes. So maybe they began to carpool, and less cars as a whole were traveling to central Stockholm, but not necessarily taking transit. We also did find that some trips didn't occur to the central city, that there were alternatives to get there, whether that was through biking or not making the trip at all. But I definitely think the park and ride facilities played a big role in the fact that even though there were transit investments, there was also investments in other ways for people to still drive, but probably carpool together.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we know that London made a really large investment in additional transit and particularly bus service to help carry the additional people that they were expecting, and did in fact switch to bus service in particular. And that's, I think, an interesting lesson learned for San Francisco, given that our rail network is much less extensive. That maybe we can learn from London's experience of really increasing bus ridership in a compelling way. Let's see. Paige, feel free to jump in if you see a question we should jump to here. So I'm looking for unanswered questions here. So I think and there's a follow-up here about from Mario about the bus improvements and implementation. Yes, in London, the bus service improvements did happen a little bit before the implementation of the charge, to basically make sure that the shift was able to happen, and that and that when the charge went into effect, there would be alternatives for people to use other than driving into the central city. I see some hands raised here. At the top of my list of hands raised is Haley. See if I can unmute
Hi.
Haley. Go ahead, Haley.
I think what stood out to me from this presentation was the pilot and the change in public sentiment in response to the pilot, and that could be a really great tool for us to use to not only build public support for something that might be, questionably popular, but also to iterate, because we don't know how it's going to what's going to happen. And so I feel like that was really that was powerful data that was shared. And also the idea that part of the pilot is a big increase, like you said, Colin, in buses either before or during as part of the process. Like that has to go simultaneously.
Yeah, thank you. And I would, yeah, I think we would all agree that the pilot idea is a really interesting one, and something that when we get to the implementation plan part of our study, we'll be definitely looking at in more detail. Bruce, do you want to, let me see if I can unmute you here. Let me unmute you. Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Hey, thank you. I had a question around the modeling of what the increase in folks that will be using public transit in New York City, and what's the capacity available, and how's that kind of line up with what's anticipated from an increase?
Yeah, good question. So I don't know that I've seen an analysis, and Gracie, feel free to jump in here, of kind of what the available capacity is. I do know that that obviously New York's subway lines are generally famously crowded, and that a lot of the revenue is intended to go towards two things. Actually, there are at least three different things. One is repairing the subway, but also bus service, particularly for outer boroughs that don't have great subway service. And then there's also sort of part of the regional negotiation was to spend some of the revenue on improving regional transit, including Metro North and the Long Island Railroad, so their commuter rail systems. I don't have a lot more. I don't have an analysis in front of me of like what the extra capacity is, but I'm sure it would depend a lot on the line or route that you're talking about. So I think that's an interesting question. So then I see Peter, you've got another question. Go ahead.
I had some questions about TNCs, and that's similar to something that Barbara just added to the Zoom chat. To me, one of the reasons that congestion pricing is important in San Francisco is as a means to tame TNC volumes, essentially. London has a flat fee, which I think is personally, I think, doomed to failure as a means of regulating TNCs. New York, it looks as if they're proposing to impose a fee on a per trip basis, which gets passed to the user, which I think is essential. At least that's how it looks. And you're silent on Stockholm. I'm wondering if you could comment a little more on how TNCs are approached, what's been effective in these cities, and what that means for us.
Sure. So I guess maybe I'll first ask Gracie, do you want to give us any or share any additional information you want to clarify about the case studies we have, and then maybe we can fill in any additional details and talk about the San Francisco thinking we're doing?
Yeah, I think for London, that's one of the issues they're continuing to evaluate, is how even though like TNCs now have to pay that flat fee as well, there's still congestion, and it's mainly due to their usage within the central zone. So that's definitely something London is taking into consideration, and something we would like to take into consideration on how we can still reduce congestion and prevent those trips that just occur where TNCs are just circling the neighborhood. However, I don't have any more information on if what is the newest improvements they're trying to make by that. And for Stockholm, it had limited information on TNC usage and TNC charging. But for New York City, they are doing the surcharge. They've been doing it on taxis and TNCs since February 2019. And even though these surcharges tend to be passed on to the user, it's something that they're testing out to see how it could improve congestion, but I don't have those specific numbers in front of me.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of San Francisco, I think we definitely see the London case as a cautionary note, and even just with our own data that we've shared with you all about how much of the congestion downtown, in terms of increase since 2010 is TNC trips, and that TNC trips are a substantial proportion of the total auto trips downtown. And we know, of course, they operate differently, and certainly somebody driving their personal car into downtown and paying the fee to get in and then parking it all day is very different than somebody who drives in, pays a fee once, and then circles all day picking up and dropping off people. So definitely one of the things we're going to be looking at as we're screening different scenarios for what congestion pricing could look like is how do we make sure that TNC vehicles are subject to and people who are choosing to ride a TNC in a TNC for their trip as opposed to hopping on Uni, that those trips are getting incentivized in the same similarly, with a similar effect on the user as a personal vehicle, because the impacts on a per trip basis are in the same ballpark of being similar. So that's definitely something we're looking at here, and we'll look at a variety of scenarios of how we might do that.
We have a question from Mario in the chat asking about was there bus improvement before the implementation of congestion pricing in these cities?
Yeah, and I think I answered that one, but Grassi, feel free to add any additional details where definitely before opening day, they had put their bus improvements in place. Grassi, do you have anything else you would want to add to that?
Yeah, so I know Stockholm did have their public transit improvements before the program. I'm not too sure about London. Sorry, I'm trying to find information. Yeah, so for Stockholm, they did expand public transit before it began, and that included the 197 new buses, the 16 new bus lines, and expanded service on existing routes, as well as the park and ride facilities, which ended up being approximately 2,800 new parking spaces at these facilities, and that's specifically for Stockholm.
Thanks, Grassi. And so members of the PAC, please feel free to raise your hands or ask questions in the chat. I have another one from who I think is a member of the public, Bonnie Kalbrowski, who's asked, what would be the financial impact to vendor or truck deliveries which have to come from outside the city because that's where their warehouses are?
For goods movement, generally, I think we haven't certainly gotten to this level of analysis. I think it's something certainly we would want to be thinking about goods movement. Generally, the idea in most of these cities is that trucks are subject to fees during the peak hours because the incentive system is intended to work for everyone. And there may be some trade-offs. Certainly, some of the evidence from other cities shows that businesses are actually able to save money because, well, they do have to pay a congestion fee. Because the congestion is so much less, they're able to get more deliveries done in a day, and therefore their operations are actually more efficient. So, we haven't done a detailed analysis of what that would look like here in San Francisco, but as we're thinking about the, sort of how much less delay there could be with a congestion pricing system, certainly there's a trade-off there that businesses in other cities have seen. So let's see, Peter has a question that's a follow-up on the park and ride about Stockholm. And I think about whether the park and ride bus rides would be counted as transit trips. And I think the answer is yes, they would be counted as transit trips if they're a park and ride bus ride. But if they're a park and ride where somebody is parking and then carpooling with somebody else, I think, Gracie, that's what you were talking about, correct?
Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
If they're included, then that doesn't explain why the 5%, why the transit increase is so low.
Well, I think the point that Gracie was making is that potentially a lot of the park and ride trips were carpool trips where people were parking and pooling, basically. Paige, do you see other PAC member questions here that we should be?
Yeah, so Robin has a question and tried to raise his hand on the phone using *9, but I don't see it. So let's see if we can unmute Robin so we can ask his question. Do you want me to do that, Colin, or do you want to do it?
Go ahead.
Okay. Robin, feel free to ask a question.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm actually sitting here on Van Ness Avenue, which is totally devoid of traffic now, and I'm watching Muni buses just zip up and down the street. At these troubled times, this is kind of a silver lining question. Is there anything we can learn from this period when there is no traffic on our streets about Muni operations, how fast buses are traveling, and other questions about like just the quality of life with less traffic, noise, no noise, and air pollution, air quality, and so forth. That maybe some things we can glean from this period. Seems like we have an opportunity here to learn what the effects of reducing congestion might be on the city. So that's my question.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. And I might ask Drew Cooper on our technology data analysis team to pipe in here, because I know they have already started to look at what the decreases in traffic are. And I think there are good questions here about whether there are other aspects like transit speeds that we could also be thinking about. Let me see if we can, I don't know if Drew can unmute himself or if we need to. Go ahead, Drew.
Hi. Thanks for the question. Yes, there are almost certainly some interesting things that we can learn from the moment that we're in. We've started exploring, looking at the observed changes in traffic congestion over the last couple of weeks. And there has already been a lot of interesting work done by others looking at changes in emissions and things like that. While there are a lot of interesting things to learn, we should also keep in mind that it's not just that traffic has been reduced, but there is a major public health crisis and probably a substantial recession that's getting started. And so we also have to keep those things in mind before trying to extrapolate conclusions about the moment that we're in to a congestion pricing program. So yeah, we're looking into seeing what we can learn, but with a note of caution about how it can be interpreted in this context.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think one example of what Drew's talking about is, you know, the Muni vehicles are going much faster in part because of the lack of traffic congestion, but they also don't have nearly as many riders on them, which means that you're not stopping at as many stops and so forth. So, so some of the, you know, one piece of that might be considered a good thing in a way where the traffic congestion is reduced, but on the other hand, you know, in a congestion pricing scenario, obviously there would still be a lot of people moving around. They would just be, say, riding Muni instead, which would actually mean that the buses might be stopped a little longer at each stop, for example. But definitely interesting questions that that we'll keep looking at. Let's see. Someone else have their hand raised here. I don't see PAC members with their hands raised. Paige, have you noticed any other questions we should jump to here?
Yeah, so Barbara has asked a few questions in the chat, and one we already responded to regarding TNCs, but another question that she asked is, so she's a resident in Portside and is curious about how the residents and homeowners in the zones will be impacted, particularly when a lot of their lifestyle activities happen in the proposed zone area. And after that, kind of a two-parter, there's a question about private charter buses and vans, and just asking or giving comment that they shouldn't be exempted or charged less. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about what we could do for charter buses and vans, how they might be affected in a congestion pricing program.
Sure. Yeah, I could talk maybe a little bit about this, and then maybe maybe Gracie can fill in with ways that the other cities have dealt with these through things like discount policies. But certainly there are, for people who are living in a congestion pricing zone, there can be advantages in terms of having less congestion on the streets around your house, and some of the quality of life things that Robin was talking about, with things like noise and safety benefits, health benefits. In terms of getting around, if you're trying to move around outside of the peak hours, it may not, where charging is in place, it may not affect you all that much. If you are driving during the peak hours when charging is in place, then there would likely be a trade-off, where on the one hand, there may be a fee, and on the other hand, there'd be a lot less congestion. But the other thing we'll be looking at is, as part of our different scenarios for exemptions and discounts, one of the things that we've heard from some folks is a desire for a discount for people who live within the congestion pricing zone. And so that is something we'll plan to look at. And maybe I'll ask Grassi if you want to talk a little bit about the things that other cities have done for both in terms of the residents and discount policies, and then also kind of high occupancy shuttle and van style vehicles, which would also be another category that we could consider how we want to treat them.
Yeah. So for London, residents who live in the zone do have a 90% discount on the fee. And like I mentioned, that just requires submitting documentation to the Transport for London agency and supporting documents. So just proof of residency, and then they'd get that 90% discount on the fee. In terms of vans or charter buses, I know London gives, it's no fee for vehicles that have over 9 seats, but they also require that registration and proof. But it doesn't say specifically if it applies to like charter buses or vans. They just have to have that 9+ seats to qualify. And in terms of Stockholm, they don't have residential discounts or exemptions, but they do have exemptions for buses who weigh over 14 tons. So Stockholm is a little, offers less discounts and exemptions than London. And I know New York's plan for residents is only giving discounts or tax credits for residents who live in the zone but make less than $60,000 a year. So that's income based.
Great, thanks, Grassi. And again, these are things that we, can continue to consider as we look at policy options here. So, any other questions we should try to tackle here? I see a number of things that I think are more comments that we certainly appreciate in the chat about folks sharing their thoughts on different kinds of vehicles that we should charge or not charge, and more about capturing the data that could be interesting right now during the pandemic. Paige, have you seen any other questions you think we should tackle here? Or does anybody want to raise their hand if you have one?
We could transition to public comment if there's interest in that.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, let's transition to public comment. And should we give just a quick reminder of what the process for public comment is? Grassi, do you want to flip forward to the public comment slide? Great. So, members of the public, thanks for joining us, and feel free to raise your hand, which you can do in one of a couple ways. If you are logged in through your computer, then you'll find if you click on the, I think it's the participant window, then there's an option there to raise your hand. So we can see that your hand is raised, and then we can unmute and call on you. And then if you are joining us from your phone, you should be able to press *9 to raise your hand. And then you can mute or unmute yourself pressing *6. And folks can also feel free to add questions in the chat window as well. And I see Shruti is asking a question which is, can we share this current status of the congestion pricing study? Yes. So where we are right now is we are in the process of beginning our screening analysis. So I think, as we've shared previously, the original plan at this point was to be doing a combination of a lot of public outreach with our initial round of co-creation sessions with different communities of concern. And we did start that process. We held 3 of those co-creation sessions in the Tenderloin, the Excelsior, and the Bayview. And they were all, I think, went really well. We got a lot of great feedback playing the card game, people really getting engaged, giving us great info on kind of how they would view trade-offs between paying a fee and what level of fee, and the discounts and exemptions that they think are most important, as well as the different kinds of investments that people would want to prioritize. Unfortunately, as soon as we felt like the ball was really rolling on those and we were feeling excited about continuing with them, this pandemic hit. So we've pressed pause on that process. So we are going to pick back up with co-creation once the pandemic has passed, but we have had to shift our focus at the moment to starting with screening some of the ideas that either we have heard already from PAC members or members of the public, or we think we're likely to hear given the concerns that we know are they're out there, or things that people are interested in seeing. So we are starting to use our technical tools that we can talk more about at the next voluntary session on that's about data and analysis to really screen a really wide variety of hundreds of different possibilities and kind of, moving, knobs and sliders in different directions on things like fees and exemptions and discounts and investment levels to see kind of how those things perform against the different goals and metrics that we have shared. So that's what we're getting started with, and we'll have to, of course, come up with some draft results that we'll share with you, and we'll also have to be ready to add things and kind of revise as needed, given that we're scrambling the order of analysis and finishing our outreach as well. So we're going to have to be a little bit flexible with that. So in terms of the next things the PAC can expect, in April, we still have scheduled our next full PAC meeting, and what we'll be doing then is giving you a preview of the scenarios that we're planning to look at and the process we're planning to look at those using, and also kind of what you might expect to be looking at in terms of kind of the format of results you would see. And then the next PAC meeting after that is in June, is when we're targeting, when we would have the actual results from that, and we would be sharing that and getting your input then. So we're continuing forward with the study, and of course, as I mentioned, we'll have to be kind of nimble with the process. So I see that we have another raised hand from Jackson Hurst. So I will unmute you and go ahead, Jackson. And we'll ask that for public comment, please try to keep it to about a minute. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I was wondering, once you have implemented congestion pricing in the downtown area, do you think there's a possibility you could extend it to I-80 and to the Golden Gate Bridge?
Great question. I think, there are certainly the density of traffic congestion in downtown San Francisco is the focus, and when we look at maps of where congestion is worst, that's the area within San Francisco that really lights up. Other places, like in Oregon, they are looking at congestion pricing on freeways around the Portland metropolitan area. So it's certainly something that can be done. On a regional level here, most of the focus is on the express lanes idea, where there are particular lanes that could either be a converted HOV lane or could be a new lane or a converted lane where people can pay a fee to keep the level of congestion in that lane down. But so far on a regional level, there has not been a look at tolling entire freeways. The other thing I should mention is there is a little bit of congestion pricing on the Bay Bridge, where there is a higher toll to cross the Bay Bridge during weekday peak hours. But you know, as you know, the parking lot on the east side of the Bay Bridge is still there, so it's not a level of additional charge that actually is high enough to really eliminate the congestion. It might make a smaller change. So that is those are the main things. And Haley from Transform is adding that Plan Bay Area is looking at the idea of tolling entire highways as a strategy. So I think at the regional level that could be something that's considered. I think it hasn't gotten as far as studies have in other places yet. So thanks, Jackson, for that question. And I see the question here from Bonnie Kalbrowski about the when the timeline, basically. And so the timeline for this study is to try to, as I mentioned, we're going to look at a whole range of different screening scenarios over the next few months. We want to then try to narrow that down through both outreach and further analysis to a few more detailed alternatives, and then ultimately a final recommendation that we would aim to come out and finish in our report by the March or so of 2021. So that's when we would bring that to our board, the Board of Supervisors, in order to essentially ask them, you know, sort of say, this is the best scenario we see for a congestion pricing program in San Francisco, and is this something we should move forward with or not? I think after that, there would be a few years before we could actually implement a congestion pricing program, given the need for further detailed design of the program, as well as actually implementing it. So that would be the timeline if we do proceed. So there isn't a particular year. We'll basically be developing an implementation strategy as one of the later steps, along with the recommendation as part of this study. Other questions? I don't see any hands raised at the moment. And does anyone else see pager? And also there are questions folks have had that I have missed. I see that Richard Rothman has his hand raised. Go ahead, Richard.
Maybe this was talked in other sessions. This is my first time, but how would, what is the plan to meter the cars? Would it be the Clipper card, or what mechanical mechanism would you use to count the cars going in and out of the congestion zone?
Yeah, great question, and thank you. We have, not settled on an exact technology solution. That's part of what we'll be looking at, and there are different ways that we could charge fees that might have some different technology implications. But the basic idea is that we would want to have some system where there's a range of ways that people could pay the fee. So there needs to be some sort of enforcement mechanism, which generally in other cities is using cameras to check license plates to make sure that the license plates that are going driving in or in and out of the zone are vehicles that have paid or will pay their fee. But then the different ways to pay the fee could be either through transponders like Fast Track, or could be connected to a Clipper account, or there could be ways to pay in cash. And also cities have systems where they send a bill to the vehicle owner afterwards. So there are a number of ways that the fee can actually be paid by the driver. And now I see a question from Roland about bridge tolls. And yes, so New York does have bridge tolls. There are bridge tolls on all the bridges from New Jersey. And well, I won't pretend to be an expert on every bridge, but anyway, there are some kind of inequities I know in New York with bridges that are tolled and some that are untolled. So there has been, one of the things they have looked at is discounts for people who are traveling with bridge tolls, and I am actually not sure if they've come to a conclusion on that or not. And maybe I'll ask Rossi if she knows.
No, I'm not sure, but yeah, there are approximately, there's like 8 bridges that go into the central business district of Manhattan. That happens.
And I'll just add that, oh, go ahead. I'll just add that we can also look at, as part of our screening analysis of different scenarios, scenarios where people who have already paid a bridge toll to get into the city could get a discount on the congestion pricing fee, given that they've already paid something, and people driving from other directions have not. Then we have a question from Barbara Inata about whether the Embarcadero would be included in the congestion zone, and we haven't defined a final geography for the congestion zone. The general area, though, would be downtown and Soma, and I think we would assume that the Embarcadero would be included in that zone, and I don't think we've gotten input at this point from people saying that there's a reason that it should not be. Certainly, it's one of the network of downtown streets that we know gets quite congested, which is where we've been targeting our look at congestion pricing. Other questions? I think we've got a few minutes and pages highlighting certainly that it's been great to have everyone joining us, and there are other ways to get involved. And if you go to our website, sfcta.org/downtown, you can see more background about the study and also sign up for our email list on the yellow bar on the website, where you can, if you didn't already use that to find out about this meeting, you can find out about future events and meetings. And when we start ramping up outreach again, you can find out about things going on there that way also. And also thanks, I know we haven't been able to respond to all of the comments. We've been focused on questions, but certainly appreciate all of the comments and thoughts that people are sharing in the chat as well. So we'll be adding those to our notes. Any final questions? Last chance in our last 2 minutes here.
I will note that we do plan on using Zoom for our next meeting happening on April 15th at 12 p.m. And I'll repaste the link into the chat box for that event. As Colin mentioned, you can sign up for our email list on our website to get notified if you aren't already. And if you have any feedback about how we've used Zoom during this session, we'd appreciate that feedback as well, because we're all learning here, but it's been really great to connect with everyone digitally during this time. All
right. Well, I haven't seen any more questions. So, but we are of course, still reachable. So if you think of a question later, please feel free to get in touch. You can use the contact at the bottom of our website to reach us. And again, thanks so much for tuning in. I think we've gotten a lot of great questions and things to think about here. So really appreciate all of your involvement. And with that, I think we can wish everyone well and hope you all stay healthy. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next session on the voluntary session on data, or the next full PAC meeting in April. And I think Paige posted some info about that in the chat box as well. So thank you all so much, and look forward to seeing you next time.